You have heard it your entire life. A goldfish has a 3-second memory. Your parents said it, your teachers said it. The person who sold you your first fish probably said it while sliding the plastic bag across the counter. It has been repeated so many times, in so many places, for so many decades, that it no longer feels like a claim. It feels like a fact. It is not a fact. It has never been a fact. Yet the strangest part, the part that almost no one talks about, is that no scientist has ever been able to trace this claim to a single founding experiment. There is no original study, no researcher whose name is attached to it, no laboratory where the measurement was made. The most repeated piece of information about the most purchased pet in the world has no verifiable scientific origin. That is where this story begins. The goldfish is unlike any other animal in the history of the pet trade. Hundreds of millions are sold every year, more than dogs, more than cats. It was the first pet for an entire generation of children. It sat on office desks and in hospital waiting rooms. It was won at carnivals and given as birthday gifts, and kept on kitchen windowsills in towns across this country. And for roughly 70 years, every one of those fish has been described using a piece of misinformation so thoroughly embedded in everyday life that questioning it has never quite been fashionable. But the science says something very different. And when you follow that science to its conclusion, you arrive at a question that is far more interesting than whether goldfish can remember. You arrive at this: why did we need to believe they couldn't? If you go looking for the scientific origin of the 3-second memory claim, you run into a wall almost immediately. There is no founding study. There is no peer-reviewed paper in which a researcher measured goldfish memory, found 3 seconds, and published the results. There is no noted scientist, no university laboratory, no single decade in which this claim first emerged from legitimate research. What you find instead is repetition. The claim appears in pet care guides, in children's encyclopedias, in magazine columns and television programs, and the casual conversation of pet store employees across the world. It has been repeated so consistently by so many people across so many decades that it developed the texture and weight of established fact. But texture is not the same thing as truth. The earliest documented appearances of the claim trace to roughly the 1950s and 1960s, the post-war era, when consumer culture was expanding rapidly, when the pet industry was professionalizing, and when goldfish bowls were being manufactured and sold at commercial scale for the first time. Before that period, the claim does not appear in any scientific literature. It does not appear in veterinary records. It does not appear in any source that researchers have been able to verify. The 3-second memory myth entered the world without an origin. It arrived fully formed, passed itself off as common knowledge, and proceeded to survive, largely unchallenged, for the better part of a century. Now, let's establish what the peer-reviewed science has actually found, because the contrast with the myth is not a subtle difference, it is an enormous one. Fish cognition research expanded significantly through the 1990s and into the 2000s, as behavioral biologists began applying structured learning and memory tests to aquatic species with the same rigor they had previously reserved for mammals and birds. What they found should have made the myth impossible to maintain. Goldfish can be conditioned using classical, Pavlovian methods. They form associations between specific stimuli and specific outcomes, and they retain those associations across weeks and months, not seconds. Studies using operant conditioning chambers, where an animal performs an action to receive a reward, found that goldfish learn to operate levers for food and return to those levers correctly when retested long after the initial training was complete. In 2003, a widely reported demonstration in the United Kingdom had young participants use simple behavioral conditioning to train goldfish to navigate toward targets for food rewards. The fish learned. The fish remembered. The researchers conducting the exercise were not surprised. They were confirming what the behavioral literature had already quietly established. The press, however, treated the results as a revelation. One headline read, "Goldfish memory longer than 3 seconds." The scientists were unsurprised. The newspapers were astonished. And that gap between what the scientific community had already established and what the general public continued to believe tells you everything about how thoroughly the myth had insulated itself from correction. In 2008, a 15-year-old student named Rory Stokes, living in Adelaide, South Australia, decided to test the goldfish memory myth for a school science project. His teacher reportedly suggested he choose a different topic. He didn't. Rory's experiment was elegant in its simplicity. He placed a small red beacon inside a fish tank. When his goldfish swam toward the beacon, a small amount of food was released into the water. Over several weeks, he ran the experiment consistently, allowing the fish to form a clear association between the beacon and the reward. Then he removed the beacon entirely. 3 months passed. When Rory reintroduced the beacon and placed the fish back into the tank, he watched. The goldfish swam directly to it. No searching, no confusion, no relearning period required. 3 months of absence, and the fish remembered exactly where the beacon had been and exactly what it meant. A 15-year-old working in his garage with basic materials, using a straightforward experimental design, had produced cleaner and more direct evidence against the 3-second myth than existed anywhere in the popular literature that had spread the claim for 50 years. He didn't need a university laboratory. He didn't need specialized equipment. He just needed to ask the question that decades of casual repetition had made it comfortable to avoid. But if the Rory Stokes experiment represents what one curious teenager could discover with basic tools, what a fully resourced university research team found in 2022 puts the myth beyond any reasonable argument. Researchers at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Israel built what they called a fish-operated vehicle, a motorized, wheeled platform carrying a water-filled tank. Sensors inside the tank tracked the goldfish's position and direction of movement in real time. When the fish moved in a direction inside the tank, the vehicle moved in that same direction. The goldfish, in effect, was steering a vehicle across a physical room. The research team placed a visual target on the far wall of the room and trained the goldfish to navigate toward it. The fish learned. They oriented toward the target. They corrected their course when they drifted off direction. They adjusted for obstacles. They reached the target, repeatedly, reliably, with increasing efficiency across training sessions. All of this in a completely foreign environment. Not water, not their tank, not any space that evolution had ever prepared a fish to navigate. They were performing spatial computation in a terrestrial room, holding a cognitive map of that space in their memory long enough to act on it, and updating that map as conditions changed. The researchers wrote in the published paper that their findings hint that navigational ability is a general cognitive skill that does not depend on the species-specific environment of the animal. In plain terms, the goldfish brain is more capable than we gave it credit for, considerably more. The 3-second memory is not a simplification. It is not a rough approximation that contains some kernel of truth. It is simply wrong. Here is where the science story becomes a human story. Because the evidence against the 3-second myth is not new. Research into fish learning and memory has existed in academic literature since at least the 1980s. The myth was never scientifically credible, not when it emerged in the 1950s, not when it spread through subsequent decades, and not at any point in the 70 years that followed. So why did it survive? Why did it not only survive but flourish, becoming one of the most universally repeated animal facts on Earth? The timing offers a clue. The 3-second myth spread maps almost exactly onto the commercial rise of the pet fish industry in mid-20th century America. Goldfish bowls, small, inexpensive, requiring no filtration system, no heater, no biological preparation, no ongoing maintenance of any complexity, became a mass-market consumer product in that era. They were sold in department stores. They were given as gifts. They were positioned as the ideal entry-level pet. Low cost, low commitment, low consequence. A living creature, marketed as decoration. But human beings are not naturally comfortable with that arrangement. We are, at baseline, empathetic animals. We experience real psychological discomfort when we believe we are causing harm to a creature in our care. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the tension that arises when two contradictory beliefs occupy the mind at the same time. Here is the contradiction that millions of people were quietly living with. You love your fish. You also keep your fish in a bowl the size of a salad spinner. No filter, no adequate oxygenation, no enrichment of any kind, and no space to do anything except circle. Those two things cannot comfortably coexist in the mind of someone who thinks of themselves as a caring person. The 3-second myth resolved that tension instantly and completely. If the fish forgets every 3 seconds, it cannot suffer from boredom, because boredom requires the ability to remember that time is passing. It cannot accumulate loneliness. It cannot feel the water quality declining around it, because that sensation resets before the animal can process it into anything resembling distress. The myth, in one elegant move, transformed neglect into irrelevance. It made the small bowl not just acceptable, but rational. It told millions of people that their fish required nothing from them beyond food, because the fish would not remember needing anything else anyway. We did not repeat the goldfish memory myth because someone measured it and found it to be true. We repeated it, generation after generation, parent to child, pet store employee to first-time buyer, because it made us comfortable with a situation we had created and preferred not to examine too closely. This dynamic did not go unnoticed by an industry with strong financial reasons to maintain the status quo. The bowl was a product with a remarkable profit structure. No filter, no heater, no substrate, no cycling chemicals. A simple glass or plastic vessel, sold alongside a small bag of flake food, at margins that made it one of the more profitable items in the pet retail environment. A consumer base that believed their fish required no cognitive stimulation, no adequate space, and no consideration of long-term welfare was a consumer base that spent minimally and questioned nothing, neither excusing nor over-condemning. The industry did not create the myth, but it also never had reason to challenge it. The myth was commercially useful in a way that the truth was not, and so the truth stayed in academic journals, and the myth stayed on the shelf beside the fish food. Let's be precise about what the science has actually established. Not what we hoped, not what we assumed, but what peer-reviewed research has consistently demonstrated about what goldfish actually remember. Goldfish show reliable memory retention across a minimum of 3 months under standard behavioral testing conditions. Some research indicates significantly longer retention periods. They recognize individual humans. A goldfish that is fed regularly by the same person will respond differently to that person than to a stranger, gathering near the glass sooner, displaying anticipatory behavior, distinguishing the familiar from the unfamiliar through visual pattern recognition. This is not instinct. This is learned recognition, retained over time. They track time. A goldfish on a consistent feeding schedule will begin gathering near its feeding area up to 15 minutes before food arrives, even when that schedule has not been reinforced for several days. It maintains an internal model of its own routine, cross-referenced with something that functions like a biological clock. They navigate. They learn the routes through mazes and recall them correctly on subsequent attempts, often with increasing efficiency. They learn to avoid specific areas of their environment associated with unpleasant experiences, and they consistently avoid them afterward without needing a reminder. They have personalities. Individual goldfish show consistent behavioral differences across time, some reliably more bold, more exploratory, more willing to approach something unfamiliar, others reliably more cautious, more measured, more risk-averse. These patterns persist over weeks and months. They are stable individual characteristics, not random variation. This is not the behavioral profile of an animal experiencing a perpetual reset. This is an animal that has been building a detailed model of its world, learning its routines, reading its environment, recognizing the faces it sees most often, tracking time, forming associations, holding memories, all of that behind the glass. While we told ourselves it was forgetting, there is a particular feeling that comes with realizing you have been wrong about something for a long time. It is not quite shame. It is something quieter than that. A recognition that the story you were told, and told others, was always incomplete. That the comfortable version of things was the version you accepted, and the more accurate version was available the entire time, if you had known where to look. The goldfish memory myth was never really about the goldfish. It was about us. About our need to live comfortably alongside our own contradictions, to keep a living creature in a small glass sphere, to see it circle in the same water, day after day, and feel, without having to investigate too carefully, that everything was fine. The fish has been watching you. It has learned your approach, recognized your face, memorized the rhythm of your schedule, and cataloged your habits with a precision that the myth told you it was incapable of. It has been doing all of this quietly, continuously, behind glass, in whatever space you gave it. It remembered everything. We just told ourselves it didn't. And there is something worth sitting with in that. Not guilt. Guilt is not particularly productive here, but the recognition that the story we tell about an animal says as much about us as it does about the animal itself. That the myths we are most committed to are often the ones doing the most work, holding something in place that we would rather not look at directly. The fish was never the simple creature we described. We were. And there is genuine good news here, is that the science does not leave you with guilt. It leaves you with understanding. And understanding is something you can actually use. The myth gave permission to do less. The science gives reason to do more. Goldfish kept in proper conditions, adequate space, stable and filtered water, a biologically balanced environment, lived demonstrably richer lives. Research on environmental enrichment in fish consistently shows measurable behavioral differences between animals given stimulating conditions and those kept in barren ones. The fish responds to its environment. It always has. We just weren't paying attention. The gap between what research has established about fish cognition and what the average aquarium keeper still believes and practices, that gap is wider than most people realize. And it is not just about goldfish. The aquarium hobby carries dozens of beliefs that circulate the way this one did, through pet stores, through online communities, through the confident repetition of things that no one has quite gotten around to verifying. Some of these beliefs are harmless. Some affect the health and well-being of the animals in your care, and some, like this one, say considerably more about human psychology than they ever said about fish. Those are the stories worth examining. And as it turns out, there are many of them left.